Good afternoon again, everyone. This is me, pre-recorded this time with a few little glitches that I hope won't prove to be too distracting. It's a long title, but it reflects a lot of the things I've been thinking about related to the activities that I've been involved with during the latter part of my career, which is working with various groups to create meaningful animal welfare standards and auditing programs. My own work has primarily been with poultry, and you'll hear me refer throughout the talk to farmers or producers, but I really hope that the comments that I'm making and the points that I'm raising in this presentation will apply across a variety of sectors, regardless of whether you work with farm animals, zoo animals, laboratory animals, or companion animals. I asked Cassandra Tucker to co-write this presentation with me because she has been doing very similar work in the cattle sector, particularly for dairy cattle, and it's been very interesting for us to sort of compare and contrast the approaches that are taken in different sectors. But broadly speaking, we've identified 5 big pieces that are important to consider for animal welfare assurance programs. That there be clear goals, support on site for program implementation, that the audit has to have integrity, that the standards have to be meaningful, and that there has to be transparency and accountability. And these things have to fit together in a very clear way in order for an assurance program to be robust. And by robust, I mean that the program actually achieves its own programmatic goals. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 of these pieces, meaningful standards and audit integrity. And these are very interrelated to one another. Each of these has multiple subparts. For example, meaningful standards have to be comprehensive, explicit, have realistic metrics, and be revised regularly. But I'm just going to talk about a small part of that in terms of how we frame standards, what is required, and from the audit perspective, how we verify those standards, that is, what is measured. We can identify 2 broad approaches to standards and auditing. The first involves specifying or measuring inputs, such as resources or management, and the second involves specifying or measuring outcomes, and those outcomes can be measured at the level of the animals, the humans, or the environment. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. In terms of specifying resources, this is a very broad category. It could include things like housing configuration, feed, water, environmental enrichments, space, or social companions. Management requirements are largely record-keeping based. That is, they involve things like documentation of relationships with consultants or contractors, for example, veterinarians, nutritionists, emergency plans, veterinary health plans, standard operating procedures that are specific to the particular sector, personnel training records, etc. In terms of measuring outcomes, as I said, we can measure those at the level of the humans. That would be, for example, personnel competencies in performing their assigned tasks or human-animal interrelationships. We can also measure outcomes at the level of the environment, for example, air quality. And outcomes can also be measured at the level of the animal. And that can be either a very broad-based kind of assessment. For example, on the left, I'm showing the welfare quality assessment protocol for poultry. I'll talk about welfare quality a bit more in a minute. But this is a very broad-scale evaluation of health, physical condition, and various aspects of behavior measured at the level of the animal. Or we can be looking for an outcome that's very specific to a particular procedure or situation in which the animal finds itself, for example, in the assessment of pain. When we look at existing farm animal welfare standards and audits, it becomes apparent that they're very heavily weighted towards specifying and measuring inputs rather than specifying and measuring outcomes. We do see some hybridization, I think particularly on the side of measuring environmental outcomes. So it would be very common in a set of standards to see specifications for ventilation and how that ventilation is to be managed, but for the verification of that to be carried out at the level of measuring things in the environment, for example, ammonia or dust. I think there are historical reasons for this emphasis on inputs in animal welfare standards and auditing programs. I know we're all very familiar with the 5 freedoms. They've been extremely influential in shaping these kinds of programs. And I'm sure that many of us could recite from memory the parts of the freedoms that I have shown on the left-hand side here, unitalicized. But what I've been thinking about is the part shown in italics about how we achieve the freedoms: by prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment, by providing an appropriate environment including shelter and a comfortable resting area, by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering, by ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain health and vigor, and by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of the animal's own kind. In other words, by providing inputs into the system. And I think, again, this has been very influential in shaping the way that we think about standards. However, as we become more sophisticated in our approach to standards and auditing programs, it's become obvious that providing these inputs does not necessarily result in the kind of welfare outcomes that we want to achieve. And for that reason, I think there's an attempt right now to kind of flip this around and ask, instead of what we should provide, ask what an animal looks like when it's free from pain, injury, or disease, free from discomfort, fear, distress, hunger, and thirst, and free to express its normal behavior. Recently, there have been 3 European projects that have attempted to develop toolkits for on-farm assessment of animal welfare, using primarily animal-based measures. The first is welfare quality. This was a very large EU-wide project with the explicit goal of defining animal-based measures for cattle, pigs, and chickens. That was followed by the AWIN project, which provided additional species coverage by developing protocols for animals that were not covered under welfare quality, for example, sheep and turkeys. And most recently, ASSUREWELL, which aimed for a further simplification of animal welfare assessment schemes using animal-based measures, but reducing the time required for the assessment. Importantly, the World Animal Health Organization, the OIE, began the process of setting global standards for animal welfare in 2004, and they now have standards for farmed animals, laboratory animals, working equids, and for some specific situations like transport and slaughter. Recognizing that it would be very difficult to set a global standard due to different capacities, housing systems, and ethical and legislative frameworks in different countries and regions, the OIE chose to emphasize outcome-based standards in their program. And I've put a quotation here. For the OIE animal welfare standards to be applicable globally, they should emphasize favorable outcomes for the animals, although in some circumstances it may be necessary to recommend specific conditions of the animal's environment and management. So, this leaves open the question of whether we should measure inputs, outcomes, or both, and if so, how do we choose? I'm a big proponent of using outcome-based measures in standards and audits. Most importantly, they're a direct measurement of what we're trying to achieve in terms of improving animal welfare. Another strength is that they identify and address problems that are relevant across situations rather than, for example, being specific to a particular housing system. An example might be something like injuries. We want to minimize those in all housing conditions. Even if their incidence and severity may differ between those situations, we still have as a goal minimizing those problems. As the OIE notes, they allow the exercise of local competencies, but also the professional judgment of people managing the animals in order to resolve problems. And they facilitate continuous improvement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Overall, outcome-based standards have much more flexibility generally than resource and management-based standards. Another thing I like about them is that they can get us out of having fruitless arguments. I found this picture in this text on a website that is designed to teach science to school children. And the question says, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? This is a question that has been pondered over the centuries. Can it be answered using the scientific method? In my career, I certainly feel like I have been mired many times in the argument of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. So, for example, I would get a question from a producer. So you say that hens have to be given 6 inches of feeder space. What if I only have 5.9? Have you ever evaluated 5.9 or 5.8? And the answer is, we'll never have a high degree of scientific certainty about many aspects of animal welfare when we try to be very prescriptive about things. And that really leaves us with 3 courses of action. Either we can stick with our professional and practical judgments and risk that producers, for example, are penalized for fairly minor effects on animal welfare. Or we can retreat into ambiguous language. That is, instead of specifying a particular number, we can say that resources should be adequate or sufficient. And that's a huge source of problems in many standards, that there will be different judgments made by different people about what those words mean. And that's a big source of frustration often in auditing programs. Or we can attempt to find valid outcomes that will answer these kinds of questions. One of the main strengths of outcome-based measures is their use to address problems that are multifactorial. And in the real world, animal welfare problems are often multifactorial. Let's take feather pecking as an example. Feather pecking is an abnormal behavior that can lead to hens in flocks becoming denuded of feathers and can lead to injury. And many factors can affect whether an outbreak of feather pecking occurs in the first place and how severe that outbreak is, including genetics, the quality of the rearing environment, diet, foraging enrichments, light intensity, and poor health status. Rather than trying to specify all of those factors by the use of resource and management-based measures, a more effective approach is to focus on the problem, which is feather pecking, measure it, and then systematically vary the input factors to reduce the problems. This is not to say that the process of using outcome-based standards is straightforward, and I think that's very nicely illustrated by the OIE broiler standard for space. The OIE does not provide a numerical value for the amount of space that's to be provided to broiler chickens. What they do is list a lot of potential outcome-based measures, including things like injury rate, contact dermatitis, behavior, parasitic infestations, and feather condition, as well as the considerations that need to go into selecting and using outcome-based measures, ranging from management capabilities to ambient conditions, to the housing system, to genetics, biosecurity strategies, and the market age and weight of the birds. Given that complexity, I'd like to walk through the general process that we use when developing outcome-based measures. The first step is to identify the most significant welfare problems, which will be sector-specific, and then determine the possible indicators we can use to measure those problems. During the development phase, we then validate the indicators to assess them for their biological relevance and to create scoring systems, assess how practical it is to use that scoring system to make measurements in situ, and then determine where, when, and how they should be measured. We then, in the next phase, actually measure them in situ. The next phase is to analyze the risk factors for the occurrence of that particular problem. We can certainly gain a lot of information about that from experimental studies, but it's also very important to carry out epidemiological studies to understand how those risk factors interact in situ. And the goal here is to capture as much variation as possible in a real-world setting. The next step is to inform about the incidence and severity of the problem via the process of benchmarking, and I'll talk about that in more detail later on. And the last phase is to provide support for continuous improvement by working to help systematically reduce risk factors, then to measure the outcomes to see if the interventions have been successful, and if not, to return to systematically reducing risk factors and measuring again until we reach our goal. In presenting those steps with arrows, I've probably given the impression that it's a process that we go through, we get to the end, and we're finished. But it's not really like that. It's not one and done. In fact, it's more like a circle. We may find as we go through these different stages that something in one of the stages causes us to have to go back to an earlier stage and reconsider the process. I'll talk more about some scenarios in which that might occur later in the talk, but just in a very broad-based way. For example, we might find when we start measuring the problem in situ and analyzing the risk factors that even though the problem we've identified is a serious animal welfare problem, we really are very constrained in our ability to address that problem using outcome-based measures. To illustrate that point, I'm going to provide some examples from each of three areas: develop, inform, and support. And I'll start with develop in terms of validating indicators. This slide shows three animal-based scoring systems that are in use for welfare assessment of broilers. The top panel shows the scoring for foot pad dermatitis, the middle panel for hockburns, and the lower panel for plumage cleanliness. Certainly, foot pad dermatitis and hockburns can be problems in their own right, causing pain to the birds. But all three of these scoring systems are also proxy measures for litter condition and potential problems with lameness. However, looking at these scoring systems raises some questions. Do scores really discriminate between good and bad outcomes? That is, are they biologically relevant? So as humans, we are able to discriminate, for example, between a score of 0 and a score of 1 on foot pad dermatitis. But does that difference really make a difference for the bird? And I think the answer to that question is very tied into the question of what are our practical and ethical goals for the scoring system. Looking at the bottom panel, for example, if our interest is in distinguishing between clean birds and dirty birds, where do we draw the dividing line? What level of dirtiness indicates an unacceptable level of litter condition or an unacceptable problem with lameness? In general, for scoring systems, simplicity is better than complexity in terms of its practicality for use in on-farm assessment. A key question that we need to address then is how we simplify scoring systems without losing critical information. My next example comes from the area of informing in terms of setting benchmarks and tolerance limits. This slide shows data taken from an epidemiological study on dairy farms looking at the incidence of lameness. The x-axis shows the percentage of lame cows and the y-axis the percentage of farms. So a few things to notice about the graph. The typical incidence of lameness on about half of dairy farms was 30% of cows. Fortunately, there were no farms that had all lame cows, but there were also no farms that had no lame cows. The best farms had about 10% lame cows. This slide illustrates for me something very important about the process of benchmarking and establishing tolerance limits for a set of standards or an audit, which is that the process is inherently subjective. And when I talk to producers now, what I tell them is that they should decide in advance very clearly what their programmatic goals are. Is the goal of establishing the tolerance limits to move all of the farmers who are in the yellow highlighted box here to the level of the typical dairy farm? Is it to move the typical dairy farm incidence down to the level of the best producers? So again, this is a value judgment. It's not really a scientific judgment. As scientists, we can determine these percentages, but it is then an issue of programmatic goals to decide where to set the tolerance limits for a particular program. There are a number of other complexities associated with benchmarking. What if the problem is important but rare? In that case, the sample size that we need may be too large to include the measure in our assessment. As an example, bumblefoot in hens is an infectious foot disorder. It's very painful. It is an animal welfare problem, but it appears to be very rare, occurring in fewer than 1% of hens in a flock. We'd have to sample a very large number of hens in order to determine on-farm incidence, and then there's very little room left for creating tolerance limits because of the rarity of the problem. And for some of these rare problems, we may then either need to take them out of the standards and the auditing or rely instead on record keeping and documented compliance with protocols. An example would be something like non-ambulatory dairy cattle, which we hope occurs very infrequently, but when it does occur, it's an important problem that has to be documented with appropriate corrective actions applied. Another question is, what if it's not one benchmark, but many benchmarks? This is something that I'm really struggling with right now. I'm working a lot with the laying hen sector, both from the industry perspective and also from animal welfare certification programs. And it's becoming very obvious that many of the important animal welfare outcomes are going to be affected by factors like age, production stage, genetics, region, and housing system. And that's going to make the process of setting benchmarks very, very complicated. The last area I'd like to address relates to support, and particularly how we systematically reduce risk factors and encourage continuous improvement. An important question to ask when we include an outcome-based measure in a standard or an audit is whether or not there are clear corrective actions to reduce or eliminate the problems. If not, including those measures can be very demoralizing and counterproductive. And we still have many multifactorial problems that we are disentangling. An example of that might be fearfulness, which is certainly important. It's one of the 5 freedoms. But at this point, we still have a very poor understanding of some of the causes of fearfulness and how the problem can be corrected. In those cases, we may need to transparently make a best guess about input-based measures that will help in reducing the problem. I'd like to return to the discussion about how we choose what kinds of measures to make. I'm going to make some suggestions about situations in which resource management or outcome-based measures should be used. These are by no means comprehensive, but they do represent things that Cass and I have been discussing about the ways to take a more systematic approach to making these kinds of decisions. So when should we use resource-based requirements? All of the standards that I'm familiar with use resource-based requirements for things that are required for health and physical condition needs. For example, food, water, and preventative health care. For example, vaccinations. It also makes sense to use these kinds of requirements when the resources are required to satisfy behavioral needs or wants, although that's certainly more variable now between different existing guidelines depending on goals. I will note, though, that in both cases it may be very challenging and uncertain to specify exactly how those resources should be provided. Another situation to use resource-based requirements is when the outcome is difficult or impossible to measure in a practical setting. Dehydration would be an example. We, in most cases, don't have adequate measures of dehydration in situ, although we can measure it in a laboratory. So in this case, we would want to be very prescriptive about how water is provided. And another example would be complex behaviors. These are very time-consuming to measure, and they require a very high standard of training. A final situation is when there is a high level of scientific certainty that the resource and/or the quality or quantity of the resource will actually improve welfare. Situations in which we should use management-based requirements, including for prohibited or restricted practices, that is, practices that are restricted in terms of how and/or when they can be performed. Examples would be things like mutilations, tail docking, beak trimming, euthanasia in terms of conduct of permissible methods or methods of killing that are not allowed. An additional situation is for important inputs that cannot normally be measured by outcomes. We can think of these as preventative measures. For example, emergency management plans, the veterinary client-patient relationship. We certainly hope that events do not occur that lead to an emergency that results in the injury of animals on farm, or that there are not serious health conditions, but we use management-based requirements to provide the preventative inputs so that these things don't happen. And the last is for point-in-time events that cannot be audited later. An example of that would be something like transport from one facility to another. When should we use outcome-based measures? We've already discussed their importance for addressing multifactorial problems. There are also opportunities for the use of outcome-based measures by refocusing our questions on what exactly the problems are that we're trying to solve. I mentioned earlier all these discussions I've had about feeder space for laying hens. Does it need to be 6 inches? Can it be 5.8 inches? And the truth is that we have very little scientific certainty about exactly how feed should be provided to hens, particularly in more complex systems like cage-free systems. Going back to asking what the problem is we're trying to solve, and in fact back to the 5 freedoms, we are trying to solve the problem of providing the diet in a way that provides ready access and maintains health and vigor. So in other words, we want healthy, normal hens that are not in a situation where they have to aggressively compete for feed. And we actually can measure those outcomes. At the flock level, for example, we can look at body weight, egg production, and mortality. And I know these kinds of flock and herd level measures are criticized because they don't focus on the individual animal in the system, but we can also look at that, at least a sample of that, by looking at uniformity in body weight among the hens in the flock and looking at the body condition of a selected number of individual birds. And fortunately, we also have some very good proxies for aggressive competition in terms of looking at comb wounding and head feather loss. However, the two situations we've been discussing, the first in which the outcome itself is the problem, and the second in which the outcome is replacing input measures, may lead us in very different directions when we think about corrective actions. Let's start first with the example of the situation where the outcome is the problem, in this case, feather pecking. We can measure the extent of feather pecking in the flock, and because of research conducted at the University of Bristol, we know that there are about 40 potential changes that producers can make in their housing or management to reduce the incidence of this problem. So those changes can be applied systematically and as they are relevant for that particular management and housing system. The situation becomes more complex, I think, when we are talking about outcomes that replace inputs. Taking feeder space as an example, there is not a one-to-one relationship between feeder space and the outcome-based measures that we are using to assess feeder space. In other words, we can envision other inputs that would also affect these particular outcomes. For example, there could be a health problem in the flock, undiagnosed, that is having effects on production variables, body weight, and contributing to problems with aggression in the flock. In this case, the corrective actions will involve determining the actual causes of the problem rather than applying a systematic strategy of reduction for a particular problem. A final but important point I'd like to make is that this really requires us to rethink our approach to auditing. For continuous improvement, we need a commitment to revising and refining standards and benchmarks regularly. Many of the measurements of interest probably cannot be made by the auditors. It's very time-consuming to collect some of these measurements. They may involve handling the animals, and importantly, it may be a matter of historical recording rather than recording during the brief period of time that the auditor is actually on site. That means the measurements are going to need to be made in real time by the people who are at the site regularly. In this sense, the auditors become record reviewers. In addition, auditors will need to determine what is an acceptable approach to corrective actions and what is not an acceptable approach. And that's a very different task than coming to a site, evaluating how well the standards are met, and then deciding if a facility passes or fails. This also raises issues related to transparency. When we take this kind of approach, there's a potentially long time frame for correction of problems. Patience is required. But how will that be viewed by the public? Is this going to be sufficient for risk management and assurance about animal welfare? It's very important for us to have the answers to those questions in order to facilitate the widespread adoption of these measures. I can take questions.